In 1945, hundreds of German women were shipped to rural America, not as prisoners locked behind bars, but as the labour force that would quietly rebuild towns. It was one of the lesser-known chapters of the war. Captured female auxiliaries, nurses, and farm workers brought across the Atlantic to fill the manpower gaps left by millions of American men fighting overseas. While Europe lay in ruins, these women found themselves in a land untouched by bombing, a place they had only heard about in propaganda leaflets. Their journey began on a grey cargo ship that creaked its way across the Atlantic in the final months of the war. Among the crowd on deck stood Lieselotte Lisa Bauer, a 26-year-old farmhand from near Dresden. She had spent her life working the soil, fixing fences and surviving air raids. Now she clutched the railing as the distant outline of the American coast came into view. She had never left Saxony before. She had never imagined she would see America, let alone work in it. When the ship reached port, the women were met not by hostility, but by quiet procedural efficiency. American soldiers processed them through makeshift docks, tagging each uniform with PW and assigning numbers. They weren't treated like combatants, they were treated like a resource. Within hours, they were loaded onto buses and sent inland. Through barred windows, the women watched as industrial skylines gave way to endless farmland. There were no bombed-out buildings, no cratered roads, just quiet fields and neat wooden houses. For many, it was the first time in years they had seen a landscape untouched by war. Their destination was a small camp on the edge of a rural Midwestern town. It was nothing like the sprawling male POW camps. A few low barracks, a fence, a couple of watchtowers. The camp looked temporary, improvised, because it was. These women weren't meant to sit idle, they were there to work. As the buses pulled through the gate, curious townspeople gathered at a distance. Farmers, shopkeepers, widows, children, all staring, some with curiosity, others with a quiet, simmering resentment. Many had lost sons in Europe. Now, German women, the enemy, had arrived in their town. That night, the women settled into bare wooden barracks. The silence was unfamiliar. No air raid sirens, no artillery, just crickets and the occasional whistle of a passing train. Lise sat by a small window, staring at the alien stars above. She didn't know it yet, but the quiet fields outside would soon depend on her hands, and those of the women around her, to rebuild a town they had never seen before. The sun was already high when the trucks rumbled through the gates the next morning. A warm wind carried the smell of wet earth and fresh grass, a smell that felt almost foreign to women who had spent years surrounded by smoke and rubble. The German prisoners stepped out in groups, blinking against the light, their boots crunching the gravel as guards guided them into the small compound. This wasn't a sprawling military complex. It was a hastily built labour camp on the edge of town. A handful of wooden barracks, a mess hall, a small infirmary, and 2 watchtowers at opposite corners. The fence that encircled the camp was tall but not oppressive. There were no guard dogs, no floodlights scanning through the night. It wasn't designed to keep people from escaping. It was designed to keep the lines clear between them and us. The camp commandant, a captain in his late 40s with a sun-leathered face, stood before the assembled women. Through a translator, his voice carried across the dusty yard. "You are here to work. You will be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. In return, you will contribute to repairing what this war has strained. Roads, fields, bridges, town property. You are not soldiers anymore. Here, you are workers." The women listened in silence. Some held their arms folded, others stared at the ground. Lise stood among them, expression unreadable. She had spent her life following the rhythms of planting seasons and harvests, rhythms that war had shattered. Now, in this strange place, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: structure. The townspeople, meanwhile, were watching. From the roads outside the fence, clusters of men and women gathered in the afternoons to catch glimpses of the new arrivals. The older men, many veterans of the Great War, observed quietly with crossed arms. Mothers whispered to each other. Some children waved curiously, earning sharp looks from their parents. For many in town, these women represented the enemy in flesh and blood. Some had lost husbands or sons on European soil. Others had spent years rationing, waiting, and worrying. And now, the very people associated with that suffering were here, not as invaders, but as workers sent to fix the town's roads, help with harvests, and repair infrastructure. The first work assignments came quickly. The women were divided into crews: road crews, tasked with filling potholes, repairing fences, and clearing drainage ditches along country lanes. Agricultural crews, sent out to local farms to harvest early crops and maintain livestock. Construction crews, a smaller group selected for basic carpentry and brickwork. Lise was placed on a road and bridge repair crew. Her experience on her family's farm made her a natural choice. She understood soil, timber, and hard labour. When she first stood before the damaged wooden bridge just outside town, she noticed the warped beams, the cracked planks, and the way the structure leaned subtly over the water. This bridge wasn't symbolic yet. It was just a broken thing that needed fixing. The first few days were stiff and uneasy. Guards stood nearby, not aggressive, but alert. Townspeople sometimes drove past slowly, staring from their cars without a word. Some spat on the ground as they passed. Others simply looked away. The women responded with quiet focus. They worked in pairs, following instructions translated through a German-speaking American overseer. At night the camp was calm. The women gathered in small groups outside the barracks, speaking in low voices. Some talked about home, some about food. A few dared to speculate about when they might be sent back to Germany. Lisa mostly listened. She sat with her back against the barracks wall, hands resting on her knees, watching the distant farmhouse lights across the fields. The tension between the town's grief and the women's silent labour hung in the air like humidity. No one trusted anyone yet. But the rhythm of daily work had begun, and with it came the first faint threads of connection, unnoticed, fragile, but growing. Within weeks those threads would tighten around something unexpected, a bridge that would change how a town saw its enemies. The morning mist hung low over the fields as the first work crews left the camp. Trucks rumbled down the dirt roads, their wooden beds filled with German women in grey PW uniforms. They sat silently, hands folded in their laps, the sound of the engine and the distant call of birds replacing the artillery and sirens they had grown used to in Europe. As the camp disappeared behind them, the town came into view, a quiet collection of wooden houses, barns, and modest civic buildings surrounded by fields that stretched to the horizon. Each group had been assigned to a specific task. The agricultural crews were sent to nearby farms, where spring planting had fallen behind schedule due to the shortage of able-bodied men. Others were dispatched to clear ditches, repair fences, or assist in the town's modest public works department. Lisa was placed in the bridge and road repair crew, a role that suited her experience on her family's farm. Her hands knew wood and soil better than anything else. The damaged bridge stood at the edge of town, spanning a narrow river that cut through the fields. It wasn't a grand structure, just a simple wooden crossing built years earlier, but it was essential. Farmers used it daily to transport goods, and townspeople crossed it to reach the rail line on the other side. Flooding from heavy rains had warped its beams and cracked several of the support planks, leaving it dangerously tilted. When the crew arrived, 2 American engineers waited by the bridge, clipboards in hand. They gave instructions through a German-speaking interpreter, explaining the work that needed to be done. The women listened carefully. Some nodded, others squinted at the structure as if calculating the labour ahead. Lisa studied the wood grain, noting where the boards had split and how the structure leaned under its own weight. She didn't say anything, but she understood the problem immediately. The first days were slow. The women were unfamiliar with the tools provided, and the Americans were cautious. Guards stood at the edges of the work site, rifles slung over their shoulders, but hands relaxed. Townspeople occasionally stopped to watch, some from car windows, others from a distance along the road. Their expressions were wary, their arms crossed tightly. These were the faces of the enemy, standing on their bridge, handling their tools. Despite the tension, a rhythm slowly began to form. The women worked in pairs, removing damaged planks, cutting replacements, hauling timber into place. The Americans oversaw, but didn't interfere often. What started as stiff, silent labour gradually took on the tempo of focused, almost wordless cooperation. A nod from an engineer, a gesture from a worker, the creak of old wood being lifted. These became the language of the site. For Lisa, the work was familiar in a way nothing else since her capture had been. She carried beams on her shoulder with the same ease she once carried fence posts on her family's land. When she knelt to check the foundation near the riverbank, her hands sank into wet earth, and for a moment she could almost forget where she was. The townspeople noticed. Some came back each day, leaning against fence posts or wagon rails, watching as the bridge slowly took shape again. A few began to whisper to one another, not in approval, but in reluctant curiosity. These women were not soldiers. They were not saboteurs. They were simply working. At night, back in the camp, exhaustion spread through the barracks like a shared language. The women sat on their bunks, hands blistered and shoulders sore. For the first time in months, their fatigue came not from fear or flight, but from honest physical labour. Conversations remained quiet, but there was a sense of direction, something tangible being built piece by piece. The bridge's progress was slow but visible. Each new beam fitted into place felt like a small defiance of the hostility hanging in the air. They weren't welcomed, but they were needed. And as the structure began to straighten under their efforts, something in the town began to shift as well. Imperceptibly at first, like the early signs of a thaw. As the days turned into weeks, the presence of the German women became an undeniable part of the town's daily rhythm. Every morning the trucks rolled out from the camp. Every afternoon they returned covered in dust, sweat and sawdust. At first the townspeople kept their distance. They watched from porches, fence lines, or the edges of fields, arms crossed, expressions guarded. But the longer the women worked, the harder it became to keep pretending they weren't there. The bridge repair site became a focal point. It stood on the main road, visible to anyone passing through, and so did the women. Farmers hauling produce slowed their wagons to watch. Children peered over fences despite their parents' sharp warnings to stay back. The women worked methodically, following the engineer's guidance, replacing warped beams, hammering fresh planks into place, and reinforcing the supports along the riverbank. One figure in particular watched more closely than most. Martha Green, a widow whose son had been killed in France the previous year. She lived in a small house overlooking the road to the bridge. Each day she stood by her gate, apron still on, hands resting on the wooden fence. Her gaze was sharp, unblinking. To her, these women weren't labourers. They were the enemy who had taken everything. Her bitterness wasn't unique. Several townspeople shared her quiet hostility. Some muttered insults under their breath as they passed the work crews. Others refused to use the repaired sections of road, taking longer detours out of sheer defiance. One man spat on the ground near the worksite and muttered something in English that needed no translation. The women didn't respond. They kept working. For the prisoners, the tension was always present but rarely spoken aloud. They felt the eyes on their backs, the unspoken judgment in every silence. And yet something curious began to happen over time. The work itself started to bridge the gap. One afternoon, a sudden summer storm rolled in from the west. Rain came down hard and fast, turning the worksite into a slick mess of mud and water. The bridge crew scrambled to secure loose beams and cover newly placed timber with tarps. The guards shouted hurried orders, unsure whether to move the women back to camp or let them finish securing the site. In the middle of the chaos, Lisa slipped down the muddy embankment trying to secure a tarp over a support beam. An American engineer instinctively reached down to help her up, their hands locking for a brief second in the downpour. For a moment no one spoke, not the guards, not the women, not the onlookers. It was just rain hammering against wood and metal, and two people working to keep a bridge from washing away. From her porch, Martha watched this scene with a clenched jaw. She didn't soften immediately, but the image of the German woman covered in mud, hauling ropes through the rain to protect the structure she herself used daily, stuck with her. The next day, when the crew returned, Martha was at her gate again, but this time, instead of glaring, she left a bucket of clean water and some rags by the fence. She didn't speak to them, didn't make eye contact. She simply set it down and walked back inside. The women noticed. They didn't say anything either, but the gesture wasn't lost on them. Similar moments began to appear elsewhere. A farmer offered the agricultural crew a few apples during a break. A group of children waved shyly at the trucks as they passed each morning. The hostility didn't disappear, but it began to crack at the edges, replaced in some corners by hesitant, practical acknowledgements. These women were helping rebuild things the town needed. Inside the camp, the change was subtle but tangible. The women returned each evening with stories of small gestures, quiet nods, or simply less hostility than before. They didn't see themselves as accepted, far from it, but the wall between enemy and worker was slowly, almost reluctantly being chipped away. By the end of the 4th week, the bridge's skeleton had been completely replaced. Its new beams were straight and strong. The townspeople began using it again, cautiously at first, then as part of their routine. Every wagon that crossed it carried a silent acknowledgement of who had made it possible. For Martha Green, that realization came one evening as she watched farmers roll across the bridge her son once used before going to war. She didn't forgive. But for the first time she stopped glaring. By midsummer, the presence of the German women had become woven into the fabric of the town's daily life. What had started as an uneasy arrangement had turned into something far more visible. Roads that had once been riddled with potholes were levelled and drained. Fields that had been struggling without enough hands to tend them now grew in orderly rows. Most noticeably, the bridge that had leaned dangerously over the river now stood straight and solid, its fresh timber pale against the older planks around it. The town hadn't planned for this transformation to happen so quickly. With so many local men overseas and resources stretched thin, progress on public works had stalled for months. The arrival of the women had filled a gap that no one had wanted to admit existed. Their labour wasn't celebrated, but it was quietly depended upon. Each morning, trucks carried crews into the surrounding area. Some repaired irrigation channels, ensuring crops wouldn't wither in the heat. Others restored sections of rural road that had fallen into disrepair. A few were tasked with reinforcing farm structures and repairing barns damaged by storms. Their work wasn't glamorous, but it was essential, the kind that kept a small town functioning beneath the surface. For the townspeople, their perception shifted slowly. It wasn't sudden forgiveness or open friendship. It was something far more practical, a recognition of necessity. Shopkeepers noticed that deliveries arrived faster now that the roads were fixed. Farmers saw their yields increase with additional hands in the fields. Mothers pushing carts across the bridge no longer worried it might collapse beneath them. These changes spoke louder than any conversation could. Among the women, a kind of unspoken pride emerged. Though they were still prisoners, their days had structure, purpose, and visible results. Lise, once quiet and reserved, found herself taking the lead on small tasks, showing younger women how to brace support beams or level fence posts. She had no formal authority, but her familiarity with manual work made her a natural anchor in the group. The American engineers began to trust her judgment on small decisions, nodding when she pointed to a loose joint or uneven plank. The townspeople noticed her too. One afternoon, as the crew worked on laying drainage tiles along a road, a farmer approached hesitantly with a jug of water. He set it down without a word and walked away. Later, one of the children from town brought over a handful of wildflowers and left them by the fence line where the women worked. No one said anything, but these gestures carried weight. Not everyone softened. Some still turned away when the trucks passed. A few refused to walk across the bridge, stubbornly clinging to old resentments. Martha Green, however, had become a silent witness to the change. She still stood by her gate most afternoons, apron tied neatly, watching. But her eyes no longer held the same hard edge. She saw the repaired bridge every day. She saw the children playing near the roads that had once been dangerous to cross. She didn't smile, she didn't wave, but she no longer turned away. Inside the camp, the women began to talk at night about what they were building. Not about Germany or their past, but about this town, this strange, quiet place where their labour had weight. For many, it was the first time since the war began that their work had created something lasting instead of destroying it. They didn't expect thanks, but they understood their own contribution. By late summer, the bridge, roads, and irrigation systems were fully operational again. The town's daily life ran smoother, quieter, stronger. No plaque bore their names, no newspaper praised their efforts, but their fingerprints were on every repaired plank, every cleared ditch, every harvested field. Without fanfare, they had rebuilt a town they had never known. And though they remained behind fences at night, outside those fences their work had become part of the landscape, as solid and enduring as the bridge itself. When autumn arrived, the fields turned golden and the air grew cool. By then the German women's presence had become almost ordinary. Trucks still rolled out each morning, engines sputtering in the mist, but now fewer townspeople stopped to stare. Their labour had become part of the background rhythm, unspoken, essential, and accepted in a quiet, practical way. The bridge, once warped and leaning, now stood firm against the river's current. Children ran across it on their way to school. Wagons laden with crops rolled steadily over its beams. Farmers crossed without slowing, no longer worrying whether it might collapse beneath them. For the townspeople, the repaired bridge was simply there, reliable and unremarkable. And yet, it bore the hands of those who had once been seen only as the enemy. As the war in Europe drew to a close, orders arrived from Washington. The POW labor program would begin winding down. Repatriation preparations started quietly. Names were checked, documents compiled, transport arranged. The women sensed the change before anyone told them. Guards grew more formal again. Work assignments shortened. The trucks still came, but fewer jobs were given. For some townspeople, this news stirred relief. For others, unexpected unease. The repaired infrastructure remained, but the workforce that had made it possible would soon disappear as suddenly as they had arrived. A few farmers, once openly suspicious, now quietly asked if certain workers might stay until the harvest was finished. The answer, of course, was no. On one of the final mornings, the bridge crew returned to their site not to repair but to inspect the finished structure one last time. The early fog drifted over the river, and the pale beams of the rebuilt span gleamed faintly in the light. Lise stood with her hands resting on the wooden rail, her gaze tracing the lines of the structure. She hadn't built it alone, but she had shaped it. Her calloused hands, her quiet knowledge, her steady labour, they were all there, locked into the wood like invisible signatures. Martha Green stood at her usual place by the gate. She didn't call out, but this time she didn't look away either. For weeks she had watched these women build, fight the storm, repair the roads, and shape something lasting. Her grief hadn't faded, but her perception had changed. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod toward the crew. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. When the day of departure came, the women were lined up near the trucks, their belongings minimal, their uniforms the same dull grey they had arrived in months earlier. Townspeople gathered at a distance, not to celebrate or mourn, but to watch. Some waved quietly. Others stood with hands in their pockets, eyes fixed on the departing convoy. The trucks rolled away down the road they themselves had helped repair, over the bridge they had rebuilt, past fields they had helped tend. There were no banners, no speeches, no photographs. Their story wasn't recorded in official histories or printed in the local paper, but their work remained. Years later, townspeople would cross that same bridge and walk those same roads without thinking about who had laid the beams or cleared the ditches. Only a few would remember the women who had arrived as strangers, worked in silence, and left without a trace of glory. Their legacy wasn't carved in stone or etched in plaques. It was built into the quiet, functional heart of a town they had never known. A legacy of labour, resilience, and unintended connection, carried not in words but in wood, soil, and memory.